and 9881. And using his power of the presidency, he wipes away Wilson's action, desegregating the Army and desegregating the federal workplace. That's really the first big movement we have in terms of knocking down Jim Crow, and of course that's at the federal level. The southern states are going to be much slower to respond, so we're going to have, darn it all, a civil rights movement based on the concept of nonviolence. And of course, most people associate this with Martin Luther King, the Baptist preacher from Alabama, who's going to be the spiritual leader of the civil rights movement. And of course, that's going to really begin in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955 and 1956, where Martin Luther King, using what he's learned from kind of the teachings of Jesus and Mahatma Gandhi of nonviolence, to do the bus boycott, which is successful. It was successful. They desegregated the buses. They showed African Americans and progressive whites that they could use their power as citizens to boycott and to engage in civil disobedience in order to change the law. So that's eventually going to lead, of course, we all know about the I Have a Dream speech in Washington in 1963. There's lots I'm skipping, guys, by the way, but that's going to result in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, court cases like the 1967 Loving versus Virginia court case, which is going to legalize interracial marriage throughout the South. And we're going to slowly start chipping away at Jim Crow through federal action and through Supreme Court decisions, not to mention the biggest one that I skipped, which is the reversal of Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1954 court case, Brown versus Board of Education, where the court is going to rule down that separate is inherently unequal, which is going to begin the process of desegregating schools throughout the South, not private institutions. That's going to happen through federal legislation, kind of a repeat of the Civil Rights Act of 1875 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is going to use the Interstate Commerce Clause to kind of broaden the scope of ending segregation, so it's including public accommodations, hotels, restaurants, and such like that. That's going to be challenged in the heart of Atlanta Motel versus United States, where the court is going to upheld the Civil Rights Act of 1964, really striking down segregation in the southern hemisphere of the United States. And of course, that's going to be followed up in 1965 when King and the civil rights forces focus on voting rights. They get the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which is going to basically put voting registration and elections under an umbrella of federal oversight to make sure that these places that are discriminating aren't doing that as much, and African Americans are going to be able to vote again and start to participate in the American democracy. In 1968, we get the Federal Housing Act, which is, of course, addressing the housing discriminatory practices that are occurring out throughout the United States. And that's pretty much the end of big federal legislation to attack the heart of Jim Crow. So there you go, guys. That was quick and simple. We're giving you really the direct explanation of Jim Crow. There's so much more to learn and to understand, which I highly encourage you to do. Hopefully you wrapped your brain enough to understand the significance of Jim Crow and the impact it had on the United States for generations to come. So there you go, guys. Giddy up for the learning. We hope that your brain is a little bit bigger than when you started before. And we certainly hope that you understand the scope and impact of the system of racism known as Jim Crow on the history and the development of the United States of America. So I'm going to say it because I always say it. Remember it because it's true. Where your attention goes, your energy flows. We'll see you guys next time that you press my buttons.
Colorado once had the second highest per capita membership in the KKK. Hi, I'm John Ferrugia. The 1920s saw an unprecedented statewide wave of power and influence of the Ku Klux Klan, and the effect of this hate lingers today. And now, Colorado Experience, KKK.
Every so often, society goes crazy, and the fringe elements of our community becomes mainstream. And that was never more apparent than in the 1920s when the Ku Klux Klan took over politics in Colorado.
They spelled the state of Colorado with a K as opposed to a C. Everybody was determined by the Grand Dragon. The governor, the state senators, city mayor, police chief, the sheriff.
It was almost 100 years ago, and here we are again with a similar environment politically and socially.
It is a cautionary tale. If we are not in denial of the power of the Klan in Colorado, we are better set up to be more honest about ourselves and who we are now.
This program was funded by the History Colorado State Historical Fund, supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
With support from the Denver Public Library, History Colorado. With additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And viewers like you. Thank you.
Between 1921 and 1925, the Klan flourishes in Colorado.
The Klan was prominent throughout the state and had a chapter clavern in all 64 counties.
The original Klan, right after the Civil War, for 6 or 7 years in the South, was a crucial force for forcing black subordination. And then there's the Klan of the 1920s, which is more or less nationwide. And then in our time, there is a recreated third round of the Klan.
We need to study the KKK for the simple reason that the terror that they inflicted on this country in the past is not revisited in the present and doesn't move forward in the future.
It's really hard to imagine how casually racist American society was in the 1920s. It was not unheard of to have lynchings of Italian immigrants or Mexicans or African Americans, even in a place like Colorado.
One of the great indicators of this growing xenophobia was D.W. Griffith's movie, The Birth of the Nation, probably the bestseller of its time, picturing a picture of these innocent white women in the South being haunted by blacks, glorifying the old South, denigrating black folks.
Like white males dressed up in Klan uniforms, standing up for the white race against a threat. And they were depicted as knights. They were on horses and they had lances.
And it really was a movie that was about the scourge of black folks in the country.
A Georgia businessman, a member of various fraternal lodges named William Joseph Simmons, revived the Ku Klux Klan. He created a social organization like the Rotary Club, except that it was based on Simmons' definition of 100% Americanism, white, native-born Protestant. And he created a hierarchy of recruiters. They called them Kleagles, who will go around the country and start local chapters, sell memberships to the Klan.
William Simmons shows up at the Brown Palace Hotel and in 1921 sets up a little group called the Denver Doers Club. And this evolves into what becomes the Klan.
The Ku Klux Klan comes to Denver and quickly spreads across the state with strongholds in Grand Junction and Canyon City. The Klan ideology mirrors the sentiments of the day. People are eager to try something new.
Coming out of the First World War, Americans were done with international adventures.
We were just coming off a period of tremendous reform, the progressive era. There was a tremendous crackdown against labor unions and others who might be affiliated with socialism.
Prohibition, women's suffrage, urban reform, immigration reform. Americans by the 1920s had enough. There were massive strikes in the United States. A lot of this unrest was blamed on Eastern and Southern European immigrants.
And also this ties into the Prohibition issue. Those Irish were still drinking their whiskey, the Germans still wanted their beer, the Italians still drank their wine, despite the law. These were lawless foreigners. We should send them back to wherever they came from.
In places like Pueblo and Trinidad, coal companies are importing huge waves of new immigrants. On the Western Slope, fruit orchards needed cheap seasonal labor as well.
There were people who believed that our nation was changing and not in a way that was positive for them. This provided fertile ground for the Klan to recruit in Colorado.
The widespread failure of Prohibition seemed to many Americans to indicate that America's morals were sliding. The automobile created these new private spaces for young people to get together.
The appeal in the 1920s for a lot of women was to get out and work, the Roaring 20s, shorter skirts. The Klan was aghast at these kinds of things.
The Klan to this day always did see themselves as a law and order institution, that they were protecting America.
This crime fixation, free-floating anxiety, what do we do after a world war? We have to get things pulled back together. We have to have the central values of 100% Americanness.
And the Klan, they were going to stop the corruption and bring law and order to the Queen City of the Plains.
The Klan has always been, at least historically, a very broad-based organization.
It opposed alcohol, it opposed extramarital sex, pregnancy out of wedlock, Catholics.
It was based upon discrimination against minority groups, the Negro and the Catholic and the Jew. There are a lot of people who fall for that kind of thing.
There's a weird hierarchy of titles. The Imperial Wizard is the national leader. That was Simmons. The leader of a state was known as the Grand Dragon. And Colorado's Grand Dragon was a man named John Galen Locke. John Galen Locke had moved to Colorado as a young man. He had served in the Spanish-American War in the Philippines, and then he got a medical degree in homeopathy.
He was a person of excessive confidence and vision, very arrogant. He was a figure who knew how to work systems and how to be not an elected official himself, but to manipulate them within an inch of their lives.
John Galen Locke was an odd-looking man. He was rotund.
He weighed 250 pounds. He was short. He was fat. Some people called him a toad. He set up a private office at 1325 Glenarm Place. You would see John Galen Locke sitting there in a throne, guarded by 2 Great Danes and also bodyguards.
He was reasonably intelligent. His office was filled with armor and things that came from the Middle Ages. He was a romantic. He thoroughly believed in what he was doing.
He kept, as his personal secretary, a Catholic. He was married to a Catholic. His lawyer was Jewish.
He was really a quite courageous man indeed. Dr. Locke had no animosity whatsoever for Jewish or Catholic or Negro. He loved these people. He would do anything to help them if they were ill. And he was so unconscious of the social consequences of what he was doing. It never occurred to him that he was doing a great disservice. To him, the Klan was a wonderful opportunity for showmanship. Oh, believe me, those Klansmen were sincere. They thought this was good. They were going to make Klansmen out of every Catholic in the state. They were going to make Klansmen out of every Jew before they got through. They thought they were saving the world.
They preyed upon these people and just scared them to death. They applied economic pressures that were fantastic, and many bankruptcies were caused by the ostracizing of people.
Locke's primary motivation was not racism, but power. Under his rule, he turned Colorado's Ku Klux Klan into an extremely powerful voting bloc.
John Galen Locke had 138 paid organizers, which start out usually with respectable established institutions, such as the Masons or the Protestant churches, and they would appear all of a sudden in their regalia in the middle of a service and donate, give money, build up goodwill, and say, we will protect you against these foreigners, against these evil elements.
Some of our best men got sucked into this thing and found out afterward just how badly they had been misled.
We were Klan Central. Colorado had the second highest per capita membership after Indiana. There were maybe 35 or 40,000 members. Nobody really knows. The Klan claimed as many as 75,000 or even up to a 250,000 what they called loyal residents.
From the high and mighty to just your average everyday coal miner. Everybody was in the Klan.
Locke was pretty good in familiarizing himself with the powers that be, with people like Gano Center, who ran a very popular restaurant here, and he changed his name to the Cool, Cozy Cafe. And he also sold Sienna cigars, the Catholics, you are not Americans.
Gano Center was a Grand Cyclops, which is a regional director of the Ku Klux Klan, and there were very few people in Colorado who were more enthusiastic about Klan membership than Gano and Lorena Center.
Flora Center organized the Women's Auxiliary of the Klan, which got to be a pretty big deal here. They were particularly worried about orphans going to any Catholic orphanages.
So the Klan has women members and women leaders. There's nothing surprising about that.
In 1921, the liberal, labor-oriented newspaper, the Denver Express, begins covering the Klan. In reaction, the KKK closes its Denver recruiting office and its Kliegels set up in Colorado Springs, where they have little luck. They are welcomed in Pueblo with promises to enforce law and order against the many immigrants working in the steel mills and coal mines. Back in Denver, the Klan exerts its power.
Warren Gash received a letter in January of 1922 threatening him.
This colored man who had been ordered out of town by the Klan simply because he was a caretaker for some widow, and the rumor went out that he was too familiar with her.
This letter said, your hide is worth more to us than to you. We're going to get you. And he took this to Philip Van Cise, the city district attorney.
Van Cise was appalled. He couldn't believe that a citizen of Denver would receive such a virulent, nasty death threat. Philip Van Cise, he was in the Colorado National Guard.